All right, today we're going to talk about timing relays. So far, when we've talked about ladder logic diagrams, we have talked about things that happen as soon as the action takes place. In other words, if I press a button, for all practical purposes with a circuit like this, as soon as I press that button, it applies power to this coil. That coil closes these contacts and turns the light on. We assume that that happens immediately. Okay? We all know that in reality it takes a certain amount of time for this to happen, and there'll be a few milliseconds between the initialization of this push button and the illumination of that light. But for all practical purposes, in industry, we say that those things happen at the same time. Okay? If you really want to break things down, and this is an important concept to talk about at some point, and I think maybe now is a good time to talk about it. There is really no such thing as two things happening at the same time. That cannot be. Okay, why is it impossible for two things to happen at the same time? Well, let's look at what time they happen. Let's say right now it's what, 9:22? Is that right?
Close enough?
Yep.
9:22 and 10/100ths of a second. And I can start adding zeros on here. And truly, is there any limit to the number of zeros that I can add?
Infinite.
Yep.
I have an infinite number of zeros, so at some point the song that Chicago had out back in the late 60s, early 70s, that was entitled, "Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is?" really does ring true, because I can't actually determine what time it is, because the minute I say, okay, it's 12 or 9:22 and this, I have to wonder, well, what comes after? What are the numbers after that? So if I can't pin down a specific time, then I also cannot say that two things happen at the same time. Okay? And we know that to be true. If you read an autobiography, you'll read about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who both died on July 4th. I think it was 1826. They both passed away. In our perspective, they died at the same time, didn't they? In terms of history. It was the same day, same year. It was almost 200 years ago.
Wow.
So now that that time has passed, we kind of look at that as being at the same time. But yet, on that day, one of them probably died at 8 in the morning and the other one died at 9:30 in the morning. They didn't really die at the same time. Okay, so we have to put that in perspective. And for us, when we put it into perspective, we look at how much time can we identify as being a difference. Okay, in other words, if it's important that this light come on at the exact same time as this, it's not going to happen. Okay, but when we're talking about an industrial machine, a conveyor belt, it really doesn't matter if that conveyor belt starts 1 millisecond later than you think it does. Okay, but on the other hand, if it's a piece of robotic equipment that is snipping an artery in someone's heart or something to do surgery, and it's in motion at the time, that 1 millisecond could make the difference between the life and death of the patient. So you have to look at time in its context. Okay? In industrial applications, we generally work with tenths of a second at a minimum and hours at a maximum. And as such, we have some devices that we're going to be talking about that are called timers. This is one here. You'll see there are several over there. They have a knob that you can use to control how much time, and that knob has ranges much like a voltmeter, 0.1 seconds, 1 second, 1 hour. So I believe I can have 300 hours of delay with this timer. Or 5 milliseconds. Somewhere in between there I can use this timer to give that to you. Okay? And that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the idea of timing. Okay? When we talk about industrial processes, we find that we use timing all the time. Here's a couple of examples. Heat to 100 degrees centigrade and stir for 5 minutes. Okay? When the heat gets to 100 degrees centigrade, it's going to turn on something somehow, and that is going to cause something to happen for 5 minutes. In this case, it just turns on. There's no timing involved. How do we set up a situation so that we can make things happen for a particular amount of time, make it wait a certain amount of time, such as the alarm in your house? When you turn the alarm on in your house, do you want it to turn on right away?
Typically, you want enough time to get out the door.
You got to have enough time to get out the door, or else it's going to think that you're the person breaking in, right? So how do we get those types of delays? Well, you already know the answer. That's the beauty of this. What I've done is I've drawn a picture of a contactor up here. Here's coil 1, here's coil 2. When the energy comes in, coil 1, coil 2, current flows through there, develops a magnetic field, pulls the normally open contact into the closed position, and connects single eye and double eye. In here, that would be represented as pushing the button and then having a closed set of contacts. Okay, and that thereby turns on the light. And as we said, this is something that's going to happen fairly quickly. We're going to energize the coil. And a certain amount of time later, the contacts. And what I'm telling you is, for the most part, we don't care about that time. As far as we're concerned, they happen at the same time. But in reality, it takes a little time for that magnetic field to develop. It takes a little bit of time for this plate to physically move from one place to the other. As we've said before, it's impossible for something to go from point A to point B without actually traveling there. And any type of travel takes time. So there's going to be a certain amount of time that's going to occur between the energizing of the coil and the closing of the contacts. But we're going to ignore that amount of time because it's smaller than anything that we would normally be concerned with in this type of application. Okay? Are we clear on that?
Yes.
Questions? Okay, so imparting a time delay into this, we will do something that we've done before. We will remove part of this drawing, and what we're going to do is we are going to strap across, where's my green? Across the coil, we are going to put in a capacitor. And on the way to the coil, we're going to put a resistor. Okay, so let's turn this on. Here's our coil energy. Our contactor will end up doing this. What will the contactor do when the coil turns on? When we apply energy to C1 here, we push the button, we apply energy to C1. What happens? Well, we have an RC time constant here, which means that the voltage across this coil, well, let's put it in different terms. Once the current starts flowing through here, where will it go? It will go into the capacitor first, and as it fills up the capacitor will develop a voltage, which will start to gradually increase the strength of this field. And once it gets strong enough, then it will close the contacts. So we'll see something like this. Where during this period, we're charged the cap. And only when the cap gets to a certain point, say right about here, does the contact close. So there's a delay that we can adjust. So think of it this way. Where's my little timer? By turning this knob, what I'm doing is I'm increasing the resistance of that resistor, which causes the capacitor to fill more slowly or more quickly, thereby turning on the coil and pulling the contact in earlier or later. So I'm adjusting a potentiometer that's limiting how fast current fills up that cap. You remember the bucket? We talked about the bucket and the spigot filling up a capacitor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One thing, of course, you have to realize is that I've modeled this. The contents of this box are not as simple as what you see there. But this is a good model as to how we can understand the delay process. We don't really care what's inside of here. It either works or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, then you get a new one. That's why we bought spares. I'm never going to take this apart and fix it. Neither are you. Okay?
So now,
Yes.
just for the sake of, so your cap is representing your timer.
Right.
Delay.
Well, actually,
So-
the resistor and the cap together.
Well, yeah. So what's the actual schematic representation for a timer? So if we were looking at one of these drawings, what would we see for that actual timer?
That's what's coming next.
Okay.
That's exactly what's coming next. We actually have 4 different types of timing relays that we're going to look at. Are you ready to spin into that now?
Yup.
Sure.
All right. We have an appreciation now for the methodology of how we can impart a time delay. Looking at the possible inside of one of these timers. Now let's talk about how they are used. The first part of this is going to be pretty much the same as whatever it was before. We'll have a push button switch or a limit switch and a coil, except we're going to call it T1 this time. You can call it anything you want. You call it Larry, Moe, or Curly, and some people do. It doesn't matter because all you're doing is establishing some form of text reference for what that coil controls so you can relate back to that coil later. Okay, then we are going to, in the second rung, we're going to put a little, looks like a little stick man.
Is that like a normally closed? Is that what that is?
Well, that's good because you recognize that when we see something like this, it's normally closed. So normally closed is part of how we will define that. You'll notice at the bottom there's a little arrow that points upwards. This little arrow indicates what motion is delayed. And in this case, it's pointing upwards, so it's the open process that's delayed. Because the arrow is pointing in the direction of opening those contacts. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
So we are going to refer this as normally closed, timed, open. NCTO, normally closed, timed, open. And I'm going to duplicate that drawing right here because we're going to keep track of all the drawings that we do. One thing that we also typically do is jot down the number of seconds or the amount of delay. So that delay is going to be 8 seconds. Okay, we're going to label this start. And we're going to label this T1A. Not happening. Not going to get to the phone in time. Okay, timers can also have more than one contact, so we can actually be timing different things simultaneously. In this case, we're only using one of those timing elements. So here's what happens. I'm going to go ahead at this point, at T0, I'm going to press the button, and my T1 coil is going to turn on at T = 0. My light bulb, LA1, actually, that's not right. I want to make sure I have a good perspective there. LA1 is on. Coming up to this point. Why? Because it's closed. And it will stay on for 8 seconds. And then it will turn off. Normally closed, the timing happens and then it opens. You see how the arrow points in the direction of the delay. The arrow points in the open direction. The opening is what is delayed by 8 seconds. It opens here, 8 seconds after the coil is energized. That means that we can also refer to this timer as an off-delay timer. Because it delays the turning off of the light. We tell the light here to turn off, and 8 seconds later it finally complies. So it's an off-delay timer, normally closed, timed, and then it opens. It's one of the hardest things for students to get is these 4 little timer things. So I want to make sure that we present it in as many ways as possible so that you understand what's going on. And if it doesn't make 100% sense right now, perhaps looking at the next one will help to bring it into focus as we, sometimes one example doesn't make sense, but when you see 2, you can see what's different and similar, and maybe that will help you to understand. So should we move on to the next one?
Yes, sir.
Sir?
Okay. Okay, now we're going to do almost exactly the same thing, except this time the arrow is pointing down. Okay. What happens when we press the start button?
T1 is energized.
T1 is energized. The light turns off immediately. This one delays on the other end. This one starts its delay when we de-energize the coil. 8 seconds go by, and then finally, after 8 seconds go by, because normally what we would expect if it were just a contactor is as soon as we de-energize the coil, this would go back to being closed and the light would come back on. But because it's a timing relay, it waits 8 seconds to come back on. This one then is normally closed, timed closed, NCTC, and in this case it is an on delay. Because the turning on of the light is delayed by the amount of time loaded into the timer. Questions on this?
Sir, pretty easy.
This one is normally open now, and the closing of the contacts is what is delayed. So that means that as soon as we apply power to the coil, the timer starts, and after the appropriate amount of time, in this case 8 seconds, the switch closes. It's timed closed. Questions on this so far? Terry, you have any? Does it make sense? Dawn? All right, all we have to do for the last one then is reverse the direction of the arrow and make it normally open, timed open. Okay, no delay in closure. The delay happens in the opening. That's what it says right here. The delay happens in the opening, and it's also in the name. Normally open, timed open. So that means it works just like a conventional coil when it comes to the energization of the coil, but when we de-energize the coil, that's when the delay starts. And in this case, what's actually delayed is the opening of the contacts, which makes this an off delay. So this one is normally open, timed open. Which is, again, an off delay. Okay, and this is the A. And then we've got lamp 1, lamp 2, lamp 3, and lamp 4. Now I can make this part bigger.
Is this something we have?
It certainly is. It's in the network under, I think it's time delay relay worksheet.
Should have printed it out in advance. But I don't have to draw it.
Okay, now we can see everything. Okay, so let's look at it rung by rung. The first rung, what type of timer do we have here?
That's a
Normally
normally
closed.
closed, and it delays,
Normally closed.
and it delays them open.
There's 4 types. None of them say it delays.
Oh, off delay.
Okay, so it's normally closed off delay, which would be this one. Normally closed timed open. Right?
Yep.
Okay, so what happens when the button is pressed? Normally closed means that this all starts out with the light on, yes? Since it's normally closed, doesn't that mean that this light is on before we even start? What do you think, Terry? In the shelf state, before I push the button, what's the status of that light?
It's going to be off because
It's,
On or off?
it's going to be off.
Off? Why do you say off?
Because the switch button, you have to push the switch to turn on the TD1, and then that'll start it up.
No, I don't.
You don't?
According to this, I have current flow through that switch to that light.
Oh.
I also have current flow through this switch to that light. This one, I do not. So when we start out, both of these lights should be on, both of these should be off. Because there's a complete path all the way to the light through the timer. It's like a switch that's normally closed. Okay? So L1 is going to be on to start out with. Okay? What type of timer is it? Normally closed,
Normally
time
closed, time
open.
open.
When does it open?
At 4 seconds
4 seconds after what?
after the switch is hit, energized, is pushed.
Okay, so this is when the switch is hit, right?
Yep.
yes.
A happens right there. Okay? As soon as A happens, does TD1 open then or not?
No.
No, it does not, because the opening is what is delayed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So it will open
At the end of 4 seconds.
at the end of 4 seconds. Let's say that's 4 seconds right there. Oops. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Okay, 4 seconds afterwards, what happens?
It opens.
It opens, right? And then, what happens when the power goes away?
It comes back on.
Immediately or after a delay?
4-second delay.
No, there's no 4-second delay.
Because it's a delay going
On.
So it immediately comes back on.
This is not delayed. Turning off is what's delayed, right? Off delay. Okay? What happens here? This is where it opens. Timed. Open. Normally closed, the light's normally on, then there's a timing, and then it opens. Okay, it's the only place it opens. It doesn't open anywhere else, so it has to be there. Are we clear on that one? What about the second one? L2. What kind of contact or timer is that?
Normally closed, time closed.
Normally closed, timed closed. Okay? If it's normally closed, let's look at this a little bit of a different way. Let's write down what we think will happen without the timing. And we would see that. With no timing, we would see that, right? What's timed?
The closing.
The closing. Okay? This is open. This is close. Right? So what gets delayed?
The closing.
The closing time, which means we actually go 4 seconds here before we close, because the closing is delayed. So there's our timing. Okay, we told the light to turn back on, but it said, no, not so fast. I gotta wait 4 seconds. So off delay, on delay. On delay. Comes back on after a delay. What about L3, Mr. Harris? What's going to happen with L3? How does it start out?
The light is off because that contact TD1 is normally open.
Normally open, and which way does it time? The arrow is pointing up.
Yes. Time close.
Okay. L3 is normally open, yes?
Mm-hmm.
We would expect it to work this way. Wouldn't we? If it weren't a timer, we would expect it to work that way, yes?
Mm-hmm.
But since it is a timer, what's getting delayed?
The closing.
The closing is getting delayed, which means that our timing will be here. Four seconds. So instead of closing when the coil activates, it will close the stated amount of time later. The fourth one is NOTO, N-O-T-O, normally open, timed open. Normally open means that the light is normally off, and we would expect that it would follow this if it were not a timer. We would expect it to close here, and we would expect it to open here. What's delayed?
Closing.
You sure? Look at the direction of the arrow.
Time to open. Oh, it's
arrow points in the opening direction. Did you catch that little funky thing they did by putting the line on the other side of the dot?
Huh.
Look at the direction. It's pointing in this direction, but the line is below the dot.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that that arrow is pointing in the open direction. We could also draw that same thing, and some people do, this way. That and this are the same. In both cases, it's pointing in the open direction. So it's not just whether the arrow points up or down, it's whether it points towards open or points towards close. Fine detail, but nonetheless important. Okay, so in this case, what's being delayed, Dawn?
The timed open.
Okay, so open is here, which means that it's actually going to not turn off for 4 seconds. So the opening is what is delayed. And again, what type of timer is that? Normally open, timed open, off delay. Notice that it delays how long it takes to turn the light off. So all this makes perfect sense. It's just the way it's drawn that can be confusing. Okay, questions? Dawn, do you have any questions?
No, right up in the air. Are we ready to look at this guy here? This little
Yup.
diagram? Dawn, are you still copying, or are you ready to move
Awesome.
I've screwed something up, but I can come back to it. If you leave the 4 relays up at the very top.
Oh, these up here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wrote something down wrong, but yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, I need to get rid of this though. All right, so we have a system here that has a motor and it has a siren. Let me make sure see if there's anything down below here. There is. All right, we'll start out with this one. Okay. What do we have? Well, we have a start. Let's talk about what happens when we press the start. Let's just follow the energy through the circuit as it goes. The first thing that we have is we have a motor overload relay here. And we'll look at where that came from, but that's the thermal protection for the motor. And of course, that's normally closed because the motor's cool now. It hasn't been on, so there's been no issue with it. It's closed. The only time that'll open is if the motor gets on, gets overloaded, and gets too hot. Then that will open, and that will break the circuit, and you will have nothing in these relays, and everything will turn off. Okay, so this is what we call a dominant start circuit because the start is closest to the L1 line. If we have the stop over here and the start over here, that becomes a dominant stop circuit. You guys will do labs on both of those types of circuits. So when we press the start button, what happens? Let's talk about a sequence. Start. What happens when the start button comes on?
Current goes through stop switch through the CR1, closes the CR1 contact.
Okay, close. Or let's not even talk about close, but let's say activate C1 coil,
Then it's
CR1 coil. Okay, what does that cause to happen?
Then the TD1 is energized.
Well, two things happen.
Yeah.
First of all, CR1 closes.
Mm-hmm.
Latching the system on, because then I can let up on the start button. Remember, that's just a push button. I don't want to have to hold that down the whole time. So I'll use a latching relay to give myself a latch. That way I press the start button, current continues now to flow through here, continues to go to the coil, and holds that connection until you either press the stop button or there's an overload. It also energizes TD1. Starts our timer. Okay, what else? There's something else that happens.
The TD1 normally open closes.
What's that?
The TD1 normally open, it'll close.
But that's going to happen after a certain amount of time.
Yeah, after the time delay is.
Oh, we're not ready for that yet. We've got something else that happens before that.
The horn's going off.
And that is the current flows through here and goes to the siren. So the timer starts, but at the same time the timer starts, the siren comes on. Okay? All right, so the siren comes on. Then the next thing that happens is the timer times out. What happens when the timer times out?
Siren goes off.
Two things. When the timer times out, this closes. M1 comes on, motor comes on. And M1, this opens, because it's normally closed. That's one of M1's contacts, so as soon as M1 comes on, siren turns off. And it stays like that until you press the stop button or until the motor overheats.
This is still part of that assignment, right?
Yeah, this is all part of that same worksheet.
I'm not going to draw it out.
Yeah, it's right in there.
So, okay. So the
Plus, this will be on the network, the video will be on the network anyways.
So the TD1 right below the CR1, the circle, is the timer that delays. And
This
then-
one?
No, up above the siren.
Oh, here, that's
So-
the coil.
Yeah, so that one, it gets energized, and then after the delay, TD1 closes. And the
That's
motor
correct.
starts. Okay, gotcha.
That's correct. So basically, this is a question of going up, pushing the button, you press the button, you get whoop, 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 boop, and then the motor starts and the siren stops. So it's just an annunciator that says, hey, the motor's going to turn on in 3 seconds or 4 seconds or whatever.
And because the start and the stop buttons are just push buttons, that means that you activate it, but the start goes back open again? Is that how you know? Because like you wrote it down, or you mentioned that you push the start button and then it opens again because the coil closes and that starts the rest of the circuit in its.
Yeah, the start button is just a push button, a momentary push button. Like these over here, if you go look at the ones that are over there, you just push them, they pop right back out. They're not latching push buttons that hold themselves down. Because the minute you have a latching push button that holds itself down, you lose the ability to control that.
Yeah.
So this control relay takes care of the latching function. It's kind of like a loop where this turns that on, which turns that on. You don't need that anymore.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Okay? Mr. Harris, do you have any questions on anything that happens that's going on? Do you follow the sequence of events that
Yep,
that
I'm
happens, and can you justify what this circuit does and why it exists? We certainly don't want a motor turning on in some cases without anyone knowing about it, especially if it's, you know, something like a big mixer that mixes a whole bunch of product and somebody's got their hands in there. You certainly want to know, you know, with proper lockout and tagout procedures, that shouldn't be an issue, but this is certainly a nice, what do you want to call it, redundant feature.
Must be a pretty loud place for them not to hear a motor running.
Yeah, but you know, you never know. Motors can also be very quiet.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions on this? See how my time is doing. How much time do I have left on my machine? How much time do I have left, Dawn?
I can't tell from here. Sorry, I'm no help.
Yeah. Looks like I only have about 2 more hours.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, we won't need that
I don't
much
know if we
time.
can
I'm
keep
not
them
going to
that
give you guys
busy.
too much of this, but I might like to look at 1 or 2 more. These are very nice little drawings for us to look at.
You know, if you know that you're going to do something like this, like refer to a homework assignment or a worksheet, it'd be nice if you let us know in advance so that when you're drawing up there, we don't have to draw it out here. We can physically look at it.
Well, and normally that's exactly what happens, but when I'm off the day before, then I don't have the opportunity
But it's all
to
your
move
fault.
that forward. So, all right, I want to look for one. There's one in particular I'm looking for. Most of these involve the same circuit. Suppose you need to build a circuit that pulses a lamp on and off. In other words, you want the lamp to do that. How would we make that happen?
Well, it would be, the lamp is off to start with, so we would need a normally open. Then we need to go to a closed, but it would have to be, there's no timing because it looks like it starts as soon as the rest of it starts.
It starts as soon as the rest of it starts, but
So
it
we need a
turns
time
off
closed.
after a certain time.
So we'd need a normally open time closed.
But the time closed wouldn't happen until after this happens,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
right?
So we'd need a, could you go negative?
No, what you need is something called a one-shot. Okay, this timer has a little knob, and we'll look at this in a little more detail in a separate lecture, but it has a little mode switch, and you can adjust this timer to work in a number of different ways. And one of the modes is what's called a one-shot. And what a one-shot does is it gives you a pulse of a specific width when it sees the push button close. Okay, a perfect example of a one-shot is a shutter button on a camera. It has a certain amount of time, aperture time or shutter speed. When you press that shutter button, you can hold the button down as long as you want, but it stops and closes the shutter after a predetermined amount of time has gone by based on the amount of light in the scene. Okay, so that's a one-shot. That is not something that's going to be easily done with these four types. It can be done by combining them, but the easy way to do it is just to use the one-shot function. Okay, one shot basically sees an impulse. It sees a start, if you will, and outputs a predetermined pulse width. That's what a one shot does. Okay, how about this one? Here's the push button, there's the lamp. How are we going to make that one happen?
Well, we're in the same boat because we can't use those up there, so it would have to, is it still gonna be a one-shot?
No, because a one-shot uses the beginning of the push button
Uses the start.
to
okay.
start. When does this start?
There's a delay.
In the middle, yeah.
The lamp turns on when?
Just before the push button turns off.
Just before the push button turns off. Sure. Lamp turns on just before the push button turns off. How do we make that happen?
Lamp turns off when the push button.
Lamp turns on.
On.
Let's say the pulse
Oh, well,
is 1 second.
when it's released, it goes off.
Let's say it's 1 second. Terry? You should have an answer for this. All of y'all, this is a
Switch.
simple problem.
When the switch is released.
When the switch is released here, this has to
Yeah.
happen beforehand.
Yeah.
To me, in my mind, the only thing I could come up with is I would need to know the time for the push button so that I can, like, let's say the time the push button is on is, say, 3 seconds. Then I could delay 2 seconds.
But we don't know that.
That's what I'm saying. My mind's not working, so I'm not
You mean
saying.
No,
like-
actually, your mind is working
I
fine.
mean, I don't see how because you said we can't go negative on these switches.
You mean like the flash of a camera?
Yeah, but this is a little bit different.
Yeah, because this has to go on just before the push button goes off, but you don't know how much the delay is.
All right, so here's the plan. I want to be buried on the same day I die. I don't want this 3-day wait. Okay? So
We can erase that.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the funeral place 3 days before I die and let them know that now is the time to prepare. Does that make sense? Doesn't that ring true?
Kind of.
But how can I predict that future? I don't know when that's going to be. I don't know when I'm going to die. I can't possibly do that unless I plan on offing myself, and that's not something that an electron is smart enough to do. So the simple answer to this, and sometimes you have to look at the simple answer, it can't be done. This cannot be done. There's no way to predict X amount of time before a push button is going to be
So
released.
we don't have enough information to make that happen.
It just can't happen. There's no way I can say, okay, push this button 5 minutes before you arrive. You're not going to know that. You can estimate it, but you don't know. You can't go backwards in time, and you can't predict the future. And that's what something like this expects you to be able to do. So that just doesn't work. The latter part of this says, okay, the technician being well educated in the ways of time delay relays takes the diagram and begins to laugh. Explain why this diagram is funny. It's funny because the guy's saying, the engineer is saying, here, predict the future. Just can't be done. So there are certain things that cannot be done. Yeah, there's a lot of fun ones. We'll do some more of these later. For today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to get across the idea of the symbols that are used for these time delay relays and how we put them in a circuit, because they're very commonly used. Anytime we need something to happen within a time base, we're going to need to use a time delay relay. Okay? A couple of other things before I finish up. It's been a long lecture today, hasn't it, Dawn?
Yes, it does.
Let's keep in mind, and some of the things that you guys are going to end up doing with these is doing something like this. There's T1, and let's say that T1 does this, and it goes to T2. Which means that we can do something like this. Start T1 and then T2. Okay, so maybe here's the start, this is the heat cycle, and this is the stir cycle. Okay, we'll heat it for 10 minutes before we start to stir it, and we'll stir it for 12 minutes. We use two of what we refer to as cascading timers. One timer controls the other timer. And that allows us to set up some very sophisticated timing diagrams. Shouldn't write what I'm thinking. Somewhere along the line, you guys are going to be doing something like this. Making me some stoplights.
Cool.
Red, yellow, and green, all timer controlled. So you might have 30 seconds on red, 5 seconds on yellow, and 25 seconds on green. you'll have to figure out how to control that circuitry. I'll tell you one thing, it's not going to be as simple as what I have drawn up there, because you also have the other direction. All right, but you can take some shortcuts with the other direction, because you can look at the red over here on the other side and say if yellow is true or green is true, then red has to be true on the other side. That red is going to happen east-west when north-south is either yellow or green. So you can use some logic to solve that problem as well. But I don't expect you guys to worry about that for a few more weeks. It's not due for a long time. You get plenty of time to think about it. Okay, so you guys will have, where's my 140 book? Over here. You guys will have several labs to explore timers. On-delay timers, lab 3.0, on-delay timers, off-delay timers. You guys, cascaded timers, looping timers, one-shots, all of that is are in here. So you guys will be working on the boards over here, doing quite a few exercises with timers. Okay? Any questions that anybody has? Dawn, you have any questions? Terry?
No, not right now.
Mr. Harris?
Let's see, where was that one? That normally open. What was that? Timed open, you said?
Which one?
The one that was, the open part was underneath?
Oh, yeah. Let me make sure you've got a grip on that, because it really depends on who's drawing it. Okay? This normally open,
Mm-hmm.
timed open. Of course, we put the arrow down here. Right?
Yep.
Doesn't really matter. It's pointing in the same direction, but that's the way we normally draw it. Normally open, timed open. Well, what is this one? Is it normally open or normally closed?
It's open.
Normally open. And which direction is the arrow pointing in?
Down to the left.
But is it pointing towards the open or closed?
Open?
Open. Both of these are normally open, tied open. You see that in this case, even though the arrow is pushing that way,
Uh-huh.
it's pushing it towards open.
Uh-huh.
And here, the arrow is pulling it towards open. They're both exactly the same. Likewise, what about this? Normally closed.
Time closed.
Timed closed,
Mhm.
right? Normally closed, timed closed. Okay, it's just a question of,
Okay.
am I pushing this up against those two dots, or am I
Mhm.
reaching up and pulling it down? In this case, I'm pushing it up against that. You see that
Yeah.
action? That's closing it. In this case, I'm closing it by reaching up and pulling.
Okay.
Same
I
thing.
get it now.
It's like that story about the guy that went to the bank. He went to the bank, he was all upset because he couldn't get in the bank, and kept pushing on the door, and then an hour later he looks down and sees the word pull.
So why would you have the two different symbols if they do the same thing? I mean, how does that change the circuit itself? Is it
Doesn't.
So it's just like engineering's choice.
Yeah, okay, here's a resistor. Let's get let's micromanage this. All right, here's a resistor. Here's another resistor. Any difference? Sure, this one
Upside
goes
down.
up, that one goes down.
Yeah.
But in terms of the part, there's no difference. It's just a question of who the guy was that drew it.
Okay.
So, you know, you have to be aware that some people will draw these things incorrectly, because I believe this to be more correct than this. But
Yeah.
you don't work with graphics designers, you work with engineers, and engineers are people that jot stuff down on pieces of paper. And the fewer questions you ask them about it, the smarter they think you are. So if you can look at that and figure out what they meant, even though they drew this with the arrowhead in the wrong direction, you still know what it means. It's kind of like saying, well, you know what, you understand what I meant. Forget what I said, but you understand what I meant. You know, so you have to kind of, you know, deal with that. Especially when it's engineers, and engineers don't always do this stuff, so they get a little rusty and they forget how to draw stuff. I've seen it happen many times, and I've done it many times. Okay? So it's just good to be familiar. Mr. Harris, any more questions? Does that clear that up for you?
Yes, sir, I'm good to go, because that was a weird one.
Good. Anybody else? We'll move into 104.